You ever see a moment so tense that it feels like the entire room just stops breathing? Like every whisper, every glance, every tiny movement suddenly matters more than anything else going on in the world. Well, according to reports that have been making rounds online, that is exactly what people are claiming happened inside that courtroom when Pooh Shiesty allegedly froze the second his own father began speaking. Now, let's be clear, this is all based on circulating reports, online discussions, and what fans are saying is going on behind the scenes. Nothing has been officially confirmed the way people are describing it, but the internet is already running wild with the story and turning it into something much bigger. Because what people are saying is not just about a court hearing, it is about betrayal, loyalty, and a moment that could change everything for a man who just recently got back on his feet. Fans are claiming emotions ran high, voices were low but intense, and the entire courtroom shifted the second his father started talking. One source online described it like this: "He didn't even look up. It was like he already knew what was coming." And that right there is what has people hooked. Because if even a small part of that is true, then you are looking at a situation where family and survival are colliding in the worst possible way. And here's where it gets even more intense. People are now debating whether this was a moment of pressure, a misunderstanding, or something far more calculated. Because when your own father is involved in a situation like this, the stakes are not just legal anymore, they are personal. Fans are shocked, timelines are flooded, and everyone is asking the same question. Did this moment really happen the way people are claiming? Or is the story being twisted into something it never was? Either way, what is being said right now is enough to shake everything up. And once you hear how this whole situation reportedly unfolded, you might start to understand why this story has people glued to their screens, trying to figure out what really went down. The atmosphere outside that courtroom that morning felt heavy in a way people could not ignore. Everyone standing around had the same look on their face, like they knew they were about to witness something ugly, personal, and impossible to walk back once it happened. Nobody could say for sure what would unfold inside, but online chatter had already turned the hearing into something much bigger than a legal update. People were not talking about paperwork or procedure. They were talking about loyalty, pressure, family fractures, and the kind of moment that can follow someone for the rest of their life. According to the reports that have been spreading all over social media, this was not shaping up to be just another day in court. People were calling it a family implosion in real time. Inside, the room was described as tense but strangely quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that makes every cough, every chair movement, every glance across the room feel louder than it should. People who claimed to be there said you could feel the nerves before anyone even spoke. There were a few familiar faces in the crowd, some legal observers, some people tied to the family, and a few others who looked like they were there simply because they knew whatever happened in that room would be all over the internet before the day was over. Some were whispering, some were pretending not to stare, and some were already preparing themselves for what they believed would be a devastating shift in the entire story. According to the buzz online, Pooh Shiesty entered looking exactly how people expected him to look: controlled, unreadable, quiet. The same energy his supporters always say makes him hard to figure out. But those same reports claimed that if you looked closely enough, there were little signs that something was off. People said his jaw looked tight, his shoulders were stiff, and he kept adjusting his posture in a way that did not seem natural. It was not panic in the obvious sense. It was more like someone trying very hard not to show that they were already bracing for impact. Fans later latched onto that detail and started calling it the moment he froze before anything had even fully unfolded. Then came the part that really set social media on fire. According to the way the story is being told online, the energy in the courtroom shifted the second his father began speaking. Again, to be clear, this is commentary based on reports, speculation, and the narrative people are building around what they believe happened. But the way this story is moving, people are treating it like the kind of betrayal they always say hurts worse when it comes from inside the house. Because in the court of public opinion, there is one thing worse than an enemy talking, and that is family saying something that can be interpreted as giving too much away.
Account claimed that his father was trying to protect himself and explain his own role, but the way he allegedly did it is what caused so much backlash. People online immediately started saying that even if he was not directly naming names or trying to destroy anybody, the tone of what he reportedly said was enough to make things messy. Fans are shocked not only because of what they think was said, but because of who they believe it came from. That is the part that hit people the hardest, because when the public thinks a father has crossed a line involving his own son, they do not just react, they explode. Some people watching from the outside were quick to defend the father, saying this may have been less about betrayal and more about survival. One fan wrote, "People always scream loyalty until it is their freedom on the line," and that comment alone sparked a whole new argument, because suddenly the internet was split right down the middle. One side believed he was simply trying to avoid getting buried in a situation that may have already spiraled too far. The other side felt like no matter how much pressure was in that room, there are just certain things you do not say when your own blood is sitting a few feet away, listening to every word. That split reaction made the story even more dramatic, because now this was not just about what happened in court. Now it was about what family loyalty is supposed to look like when everything is falling apart. Should a father stay silent if speaking could save himself? Should a son expect complete protection even if the situation is already dangerous for everybody involved? And if someone talks under pressure, is that betrayal or just reality hitting harder than pride? Those are the questions that started turning this from a legal headline into a full-blown family drama that fans could not stop talking about. People also began pointing out how different this whole situation felt compared to the image Pooh had been trying to rebuild. Since coming home, there had been so much conversation about focus, second chances, discipline, and whether he could move smarter this time around. That is why these reports hit the way they did. Because even if the details are still being debated online, the optics alone were enough to shake supporters. One person posted, "He just got his name back moving right, and now this kind of mess is attached to him again?" And that frustration showed up everywhere. People were not just reacting to gossip, they were reacting to the fear that a comeback story might be getting swallowed by chaos before it even had a chance to breathe. What made everything feel even heavier was the way fans described Pooh's reaction. The phrase that kept popping up again and again was that he went cold. Not loud, not emotional, not explosive, just cold. People said he didn't look around much, didn't seem interested in anyone else in the room, didn't even carry himself like someone expecting support. If anything, the reports painted him as someone sitting in silence while realizing the situation may have become way more complicated than he thought it would. And honestly, that image is part of why the story grabbed so many people. Because it's one thing to hear that a courtroom got tense, it's another thing entirely to imagine a man sitting there while his own father says things that the public might never let either of them live down. There were also whispers that some people close to the family were already on edge before the hearing even started. According to online gossip pages, certain relatives had been avoiding each other, some close friends were refusing to comment, and a few people in the extended circle were allegedly telling others not to post anything until they understood how serious the situation actually was. That only made the entire story feel more explosive, because when the people closest to a situation go quiet, fans immediately assume something deeper is happening behind the scenes. And that silence started feeding the theory that whatever happened in that courtroom may have done more damage inside the family than anybody wanted to admit. One of the biggest reasons this story has taken off the way it has is because it touches something people instantly understand. Betrayal hits harder when it comes from the people who are supposed to protect you. And whether that is what really happened here or not, that is the emotional angle the internet has locked onto. People are not just asking what was said, they are asking what it means. What kind of conversations happen after that? What does a son say to his father after a moment like that? What does a father even say in his own defense if the whole world is already calling him a snitch before he ever gets a chance to explain himself? And that is where the story really starts to get darker, because according to the narrative building online, this was not just a courtroom moment. This may have been the
beginning of a much bigger fallout. The kind that spills beyond legal trouble and straight into trust issues, family resentment, and the kind of damage that does not disappear just because the hearing ends and everybody goes home. By the time people walked out of that building, fans were already saying the same thing over and over again. If these reports are even halfway true, then nothing about this family dynamic is going to look the same after this. By the time people started leaving the courtroom and posting their first reactions online, the story had already grown bigger than whatever was actually said inside. That is how these situations move now. One look, one rumor, one sentence repeated out of context, and suddenly the internet built a whole movie around it before anyone close to the situation even gets the chance to speak. And in this case, that movie was brutal. Fans were not just reacting to the possibility that a father may have said too much. They were reacting to the emotional weight of what it would mean if even part of it was true. According to several pages covering the situation, the first real shift happened not when his father started speaking, but when people noticed the way Pooh reportedly stopped moving altogether. One person claimed he had been shifting in his seat earlier, glancing toward the front every so often, but once the conversation turned more personal, his body language allegedly changed. The description that kept circulating was simple but powerful. He looked stuck. That one phrase spread fast because it painted a picture fans could immediately latch onto. Not rage, not tears, not a scene. Just that frozen stillness people get when they hear something they were not prepared to hear from someone they never thought would say it. And once that image took hold, the internet did what it always does. It filled in the blanks. Suddenly, everybody had a theory. Some people said his father had been under enormous pressure and was trying to separate himself from whatever the court was trying to connect him to. Others argued that even if he was scared, there is a line you do not cross when your son is sitting right there and his whole future could be hanging in the balance. One post that got a lot of attention said, "You can tell when somebody is trying to save themselves, and that is what people think they saw." That comment alone opened the floodgates. What made it worse was the way some online commentators started breaking the whole thing down like a betrayal timeline. They were saying this was not some random courtroom misunderstanding that came out of nowhere. They were framing it like there had been tension behind the scenes for a while, and that what happened in court was just the first public crack people were finally able to see. Again, nothing about that has been confirmed, but when a story like this gets wrapped in family tension, fans stop thinking in facts and start thinking in feelings, and feelings spread way faster. Some reports even claim that before the hearing, there had already been friction in the family over how certain situations were being handled, who was staying quiet, who was talking too much, and who was trying to protect themselves first. Once those rumors started mixing with what people believed happened in court, the story exploded into something much more personal. It stopped being just about legal danger. Now it was about whether this family had been quietly cracking under pressure for longer than anyone realized. That is where the emotional side of this really kicked in, because when people think about a father and son in a situation like this, they don't just see court papers and headlines, they imagine history. They imagine all the conversations that probably happened behind closed doors, all the warnings, all the advice, all the moments where maybe somebody tried to stop something before it got too far. And if that is even close to what the situation involves, then fans are not just watching a case, they're watching years of tension, pride, fear, and silence boil over in public. One thing that kept getting repeated by people online was that the father allegedly looked drained, not aggressive. That detail mattered because it changed how some people interpreted the whole scene. Instead of seeing him as cold or calculated, they started viewing him as somebody who may have reached a point where fear took over everything else. One fan wrote, "He looked like a man trying not to drown." And while that might sound dramatic, it actually captured why so many people could not agree on whether to be angry at him or feel sorry for him. Because if he really did say something that hurt his son's position, was that betrayal or desperation? On the other side of that argument were the people who were not trying to hear any excuse. They were saying pressure doesn't suddenly make you forget who your people are. They were saying family is supposed to mean more
than fear, and if you break under pressure when things get real, then maybe your loyalty was never as solid as people thought. Some comments were absolutely ruthless. If your own father folds, what are you even supposed to trust after that? Another said, that kind of pain changes a man forever. And honestly, that is why this story keeps pulling people in. Because whether the details are accurate or not, the emotional idea behind it hits hard. Behind all of that was the larger issue fans kept circling back to. Pooh had only recently gotten to a point where people were beginning to talk about his future in a more hopeful way. There was this sense that if he stayed focused, avoided the noise, and kept his circle tight, he could build a real second chapter. People wanted that comeback narrative. They wanted to believe he had learned from everything that happened before. So when these reports started spreading, it did not just feel like another controversy. It felt like a setback to the image people had just started rebuilding in their heads. And that is why the reactions from fans felt so personal. It was not just disappointment. It was almost frustration mixed with disbelief, like people were watching something fragile get shaken again before it ever had the chance to fully stabilize. One supporter posted, "It is like every time he starts moving in the right direction, something comes out of nowhere and drags him back into this cloud." That comment got shared a lot because it captured what a lot of people were feeling, not just shock, but exhaustion. Then things got even messier when a few gossip pages started claiming there may have been more tension in the room than what people first realized. According to some of those reports, there were moments where certain people seated behind the family exchanged looks, whispered to each other, and appeared visibly uncomfortable while the hearing was unfolding. Nobody could prove what those reactions meant, but online that did not matter. People immediately started assuming those expressions confirmed something major had gone wrong. And once that kind of assumption starts, it takes on a life of its own. Some fans even began speculating that this courtroom moment might have already changed relationships within the family before the hearing was even over, not because of one dramatic outburst, but because of what was implied. That's the thing about public fallout. Sometimes the damage is not caused by what is shouted. Sometimes it is caused by what is quietly understood. And according to the way people are telling this story, there were things said or suggested in that room that may have left certain family members looking at each other differently by the time the hearing ended. What really intensified the conversation was how quickly people started imagining what the private aftermath must have looked like. Because the second court is over, the cameras are gone, and the crowd disappears, that's when the real tension begins. Did they speak afterward? Did anybody try to explain? Did anyone even know what to say? Fans were building entire scenes in their heads, imagining a hallway conversation that never should have had to happen, imagining a son looking at his father like a stranger, imagining a father trying to justify words that might have sounded harmless to him, but devastating to everyone else. And once the public started picturing that kind of aftermath, there was no going back. The story stopped being about one hearing and became about a relationship possibly falling apart in real time. People were no longer just asking what happened in court. They were asking whether trust inside that family had already been broken beyond repair. That question got even louder when a few commentators pointed out something that had not been discussed enough yet. If the father was truly trying to protect himself, then maybe what happened in that room was not impulsive at all. Maybe it was calculated. Maybe he had already made peace with the fact that he needed to save his own future first, even if it meant putting his son in an impossible emotional position. That theory made people furious because it took the story from tragic to cold. And the second fans start believing someone acted strategically in a family situation, they become much less forgiving. Still, not everybody agreed with that interpretation. There were others who insisted that the public was reading too much into a tense courtroom scene and projecting betrayal on something they didn't fully understand. They argued that legal language can sound worse than it is, that people under pressure say things awkwardly, and that internet culture loves turning pain into entertainment before anyone has all the facts. That's a fair point, but fairness rarely slows down a story once the emotional version of it has already taken over. And by that point, the emotional version had absolutely taken over, because the image people
could not shake was still the same one from the beginning. Pooh sitting there, reportedly cold and silent, while the room around him seemed to shift in a way nobody could ignore. Whether that moment was exactly what the internet says it was or not, one thing is obvious. People believe they just witnessed the beginning of something far more painful than a courtroom update. They believe they may have just seen a family start breaking in public. By the time the conversation reached its peak online, the story had already transformed into something far deeper than a courtroom moment. It had become a full narrative about trust, pressure, and what happens when reality forces people into decisions they never thought they would have to make. And the more people talked about it, the more layers they started adding. What started as a simple claim about what may have been said inside that room quickly turned into a discussion about everything surrounding it: the past, the pressure, the expectations, and the consequences that might follow. Some commentators began pulling up Pooh Shiesty's history, not to judge, but to understand the weight of the situation. They pointed out how much attention had been on him ever since he stepped back into the spotlight. Every move, every appearance, every decision had been watched closely. People were not just following his career, they were tracking his choices. And because of that, any rumor tied to him carries more impact than usual. So when these reports about the courtroom started spreading, it did not feel like an isolated incident. It felt like something that could affect everything moving forward. That is why so many people kept going back to the same question. If the situation inside that courtroom was even half as serious as people are claiming, then what does that mean for what comes next? Because even without confirmed details, perception alone can shift everything. In today's world, once a narrative sticks, it becomes part of how people see you, whether it is accurate or not. And right now, the narrative building around the situation is intense. Another thing that started gaining attention was the idea that this was not just about legal pressure. It was about emotional pressure stacking on top of everything else. Some fans said they could not imagine being in that position, sitting there while someone you trust is speaking in a way that could be interpreted in so many different ways. One person wrote, "It's not just what was said, it's how it feels when you hear it." And that line stuck with a lot of people because it shifted the focus from facts to emotions. At the same time, some insiders claimed that the environment leading up to this moment had already been tense. Again, nothing officially confirmed, but according to certain pages, there had been conversations behind the scenes about how to handle the situation, what to say and what not to say. If that is true, then what happened in that courtroom might not have been a surprise to everyone involved. And if it wasn't a surprise, then that raises even more questions about how deep the situation really goes. There were also reports suggesting that some people close to the family were already choosing sides, even if they weren't saying it publicly. You could see it in subtle ways, according to fans. Who was posting what? Who was staying quiet? Who was avoiding the topic completely? In situations like this, silence can speak just as loudly as words. And right now, that silence is making people even more curious. Then came another twist in the conversation. Some commentators started asking whether the public reaction itself was making things worse. Because once people start labeling something as snitching, it carries a weight that is hard to shake, even if the situation is more complicated than that label suggests. A few voices online tried to slow things down, saying that the word was being used too quickly without understanding the full context. But by then, the label had already taken hold. Fans are shocked, not just by the possibility of what happened, but by how quickly the narrative escalated. One moment people were discussing a hearing, and the next moment they were debating loyalty, betrayal, and long-term consequences. That shift is what turned the story into something that feels bigger than it actually is, at least for now. Some people even began speculating about how this could affect relationships moving forward, not just between father and son, but within the entire circle around them. Because when something like this becomes public, it doesn't stay contained, it spreads. It affects how people communicate, how they trust each other, and how they move in the future. One fan commented, "Once something like this is out there, you cannot just go back to normal." And that idea has been echoing across discussions ever since. Another angle that gained traction was the idea of expectations. People had
certain expectations about how this situation would play out, about how loyalty would look under pressure, about how family would respond when things got difficult. And when those expectations do not match what people believe they are seeing, the reaction becomes even stronger. It is not just disappointment, it is confusion. And that confusion is feeding the story even more, because without clear answers, people start creating their own versions of what happened. Some are more sympathetic, some are more critical, but all of them are adding fuel to the same fire. The longer the silence continues from those directly involved, the more space there is for speculation to grow. At the same time, there are still voices reminding everyone that this is a developing situation, that what is being discussed right now is based on reports, reactions, and interpretations, not confirmed details. And that distinction matters, because in situations like this, the difference between what is said and what is believed can be huge. Still, even with that reminder, the emotional impact of the story is hard to ignore, because at its core, this is not just about a courtroom. It is about people trying to understand how far loyalty goes when everything is on the line. It is about how quickly things can shift when pressure enters the picture. And it is about how one moment, whether fully understood or not, can change the way an entire situation is viewed. As more people continue to talk about it, the story keeps evolving. New opinions, new interpretations, new angles. Some are calling it a misunderstanding, others are calling it something much more serious. But regardless of where people stand, one thing is clear. This situation has captured attention in a way that is not slowing down anytime soon. And now, the focus is starting to move toward what happens next. Because once the initial shock fades, people start looking ahead. They start asking how this will play out, how it will be addressed, and whether the narrative will shift again as more information comes out. Right now, those questions do not have clear answers, but they are shaping the way people are watching this story unfold. Because if there is one thing everyone seems to agree on, it is this. Whatever actually happened inside that courtroom, the way it is being perceived right now has already changed the conversation. And once the conversation changes, everything connected to it starts to feel different too. And that is exactly why this whole situation has refused to die down. Because now people are not just watching a story unfold, they are watching what could become the emotional fallout of everything that came before it. Once the courtroom talk started spreading, it was no longer just about one tense appearance or one set of alleged statements. Now fans were looking at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture felt messy, personal, and dangerously unpredictable. One thing that made this hit even harder was the timing. There was already so much attention around Pooh Shiesty's next chapter, so many eyes waiting to see whether he would keep things steady, stay focused, and move differently this time. That is why these reports landed with such force. Whether the details are accurate or not, the story showed up at the worst possible moment for someone trying to protect a comeback. And once that kind of headline starts circulating, it sticks to everything. Every appearance, every move, every silence after that.
starts getting interpreted through the lens of what people think just happened. Some fans started saying the most painful part of all of this is not even the legal angle people are obsessing over online. To them, the real damage would be emotional, because if the public really believes there was a moment where a father said something that made his son go cold in that room, then that's the kind of wound people do not just laugh off and move on from. That kind of thing sits with you. It changes how you hear people. It changes how you trust them. And if there was already pressure building behind the scenes before this, then what happened in court may have only pushed everything closer to the edge. There were also whispers that some people in the wider circle are already distancing themselves quietly, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the subtle way people do when they sense that a situation is becoming too heavy to be attached to publicly. Fans picked up on that almost immediately. They started watching who was showing support, who was staying silent, who was posting like nothing happened, and who suddenly seemed to disappear. In celebrity situations, people notice everything, and when they feel like a circle is starting to shift, they read that as confirmation that the drama behind the scenes might be even deeper than what is being discussed out loud. That is another reason emotions ran higher on this story, because it doesn't feel isolated, it feels connected to
reputation, to trust, to image, to the people standing close enough to either protect you or quietly step away when things start going left. And fans know how quickly that can change everything. One bad headline can create distance. One ugly rumor can make people nervous. One moment in public can cause private relationships to move differently forever. Some people online have tried to bring a little balance to the conversation, pointing out that public reactions often move faster than the truth. And honestly, that is fair. Sometimes a tense courtroom exchange gets twisted into something more dramatic than what it actually was. Sometimes body language gets overanalyzed. Sometimes silence gets turned into guilt or heartbreak when it might just be shock, frustration, or exhaustion. But the problem is, once people emotionally connect to a version of a story, it becomes very hard to slow them down. And that emotional version is exactly what has taken over here. People are not stuck on legal terms or technical details. They are stuck on the image. A son sitting there, a father speaking, the room going still, the energy changing, the idea that maybe, just maybe, something was said in that moment that neither of them can ever really take back. That is the version fans keep replaying in their heads. That is the version that turned this from a hearing into a headline. What also made this feel even more intense is the way the internet has started turning it into a test of character for everyone involved. People are asking questions that go way beyond what happened in court. They are asking who was really solid, who folded under pressure, who stayed quiet, who protected who looked out for themselves first. And once people start turning a situation into a character test, every little thing becomes symbolic. Every silence means something. Every expression gets dissected. Every absence gets noticed. The family was left divided in the public conversation almost instantly. Some viewers believe the father deserves understanding because fear makes people unpredictable. Others believe there is no amount of fear that excuses saying something that could damage your own child. And because both sides feel emotionally convinced, there is no easy middle ground. That is why this story keeps growing instead of fading. People are not just consuming it, they are arguing through it. And maybe that is the darkest part of all this. If the reports are even partly true, then the people at the center of this are not just dealing with legal stress or internet noise. They may also be dealing with the painful reality that once family trust gets questioned in public, it is almost impossible to put it back together in private. Even if explanations happen later, even if tempers cool down, even if the public eventually moves on to the next story, the feeling of that moment can still stay behind. That is why so many people believe this changes everything, not necessarily because of one sentence or one courtroom appearance, but because of what it symbolizes. It symbolizes pressure finally hitting the point where everybody involved may have been forced to reveal who they really are under stress. And when that happens in public, people never forget it. Especially not fans, especially not critics, and especially not the internet. Right now, there are still more questions than answers. Was this a betrayal the public is exaggerating? Was it a misunderstood moment that got twisted into something uglier than it really was? Or was it exactly what people are afraid it looked like? A father trying to save himself while his son sat there realizing that the rules had just changed. That uncertainty is exactly what is keeping this story alive. Because if there is one thing people cannot resist, it's a story where family, pressure, silence, and public humiliation all collide at the same time. And that is why this headline has hit so hard. It feels raw, it feels uncomfortable, and most of all, it feels unfinished in the kind of way that keeps fans watching for whatever comes next. For now, all anybody can really do is watch how this continues to unfold.
Pay attention to what is said publicly and read between the lines of what is not being said at all. Because sometimes the loudest part of a story is not the statement itself. It is the silence that follows after. Everybody realizes nothing between the people involved is ever going to feel quite the same again. And that is why this whole situation has people completely split right now. Because if even a piece of what is being reported is true, then this was never just about a courtroom appearance. This was about pressure, family loyalty, survival, and a moment that may have changed how these people see each other forever. Now again, this is all commentary based on the reports, reactions, and stories circulating online. We are not saying every single detail happened exactly the way the internet is telling it, but
one thing is very clear. This story has already taken on a life of its own, and fans are shocked by how deep and personal it seems to be getting. Because when your own father is the one at the center of the conversation, emotions are always going to run high. And whether this turns out to be a misunderstanding, a twisted rumor, or something much more serious, the family was left divided in the court of public opinion almost instantly. So now the big question is this. Do you think Pooh Shiesty's father really crossed the line? Or do you think the internet is blowing this whole thing way out of proportion? Drop your opinion in the comments because I really want to know where you stand on this one. And if you enjoyed this kind of dramatic celebrity commentary, breaking hip-hop news, and wild internet stories that everyone is talking about, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next update. Because trust me, if more comes out about this situation, you already know we are going to be right here talking about all of it. And before you leave, click on the next video on your screen right now, because if you thought this story was messy, the next one is even crazier.